Warning disclaimer. The following story is a work of fiction inspired by urban legends, folklore, and popular paranormal tales involving well-known celebrities. It does not claim to present factual events and is intended solely for entertainment purposes. Any similarities to actual persons, living or deceased, are purely coincidental. This narrative contains supernatural themes, which may be unsettling for some listeners or readers. Discretion is advised. The Roosevelt Hotel in Los Angeles stands like a timeless relic, shadowed by stories too old to verify yet too disturbing to ignore. Hollywood Boulevard may buzz with lights and laughter, but inside the walls of Suite 1200, once occupied by Marilyn Monroe, a different energy lingers. When historical researcher Andrew Hayes checked in for a week-long study of the hotel's most haunted spaces, he thought he was chasing whispers of fame. Instead, he found himself slipping into a nightmare. Andrew arrived with a suitcase full of books, vintage news clippings, and an old Polaroid camera. He was calm, analytical, and skeptical, just the kind of man who believed every ghost story had a rational explanation. But from the very first night, his skepticism began to crack. It started with the mirror. There was a tall, ornate mirror standing opposite the bed framed in gold, untouched by dust and oddly cold to the touch. As Andrew prepared to sleep, he noticed something unusual. His reflection lagged a moment behind. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the result of exhaustion. But as the clock inched toward midnight, the room grew quiet, unsettlingly quiet. That's when he saw her. In the reflection, a woman with platinum blonde curls stood behind him. Dressed in a silk robe, she ran a silver brush through her hair. Marilyn Monroe. Andrew spun around. No one. The room was empty, silent. Heart racing, he turned back to the mirror. Gone. The woman had vanished. Night after night, the visions returned. Marilyn would appear in the mirror, performing the same routine, brushing her hair, humming softly, turning ever so slightly toward him. But each time, she got closer, her face clearer, her expression sadder. On the fourth night, the mirror didn't reflect Andrew at all. Only her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, whispering something he couldn't quite make out. Determined to find answers, Andrew visited the hotel archives the next morning. He uncovered a troubling detail. That mirror had been removed decades ago, following a string of complaints from guests who claimed it reflected things that weren't there. It had reportedly been stored in the basement and never returned to any room. So how had it ended up in Suite 1200? Andrew rushed back to his room. The mirror was still there, but now covered in fog. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch the glass, and his fingers disappeared into it. Cold air rushed out, and suddenly he was staring into another room entirely, one frozen in time, like a 1950s film set. Marilyn stood within, looking directly at him now. "I never left," she whispered. "They buried me, but they never let me rest." Terrified, Andrew pulled his hand back. The vision faded, and the room returned to normal, but the mirror had cracked down the center. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he packed his things and left the hotel by dawn. He never submitted his article, never returned to finish his research. But months later, another guest checked into Suite 1200 and reported the same thing, blonde woman in the mirror, brushing her hair, trying to say something. Some say Marilyn's soul lingers because of a life spent under constant scrutiny. Others believe it was the mirror that captured her spirit the night she died, reflecting not just her beauty, but her suffering. Whatever the truth may be, one thing remains certain: the mirror in Suite 1200 has a memory of its own. And it doesn't forget the dead. Graceland stands not just as a museum to Elvis Presley's life, but as a shrine, a pilgrimage site for those who still believe the king lives on. By day, it's crowded with tour groups, flashing cameras, and velvet ropes. But by night, the air changes. The lights dim, the corridors grow silent, and stories awaken, stories few dare to tell out loud. Among them is one chilling account from a young musician named Jacob Price, whose secret visit to Graceland turned into a haunting he would never forget. Jacob was a talented pianist, a devoted Elvis fan, and an aspiring songwriter who believed music could touch the dead. After winning a regional contest, he was offered a special after-hours tour of Graceland, part of a publicity event for young artists. But instead of joining the group, Jacob had a different plan. He slipped away, tiptoeing past security, and made his way to the music room, the one Elvis used to play in during his late-night sessions. Jacob wasn't trying to steal or cause trouble. He only wanted to sit at the king's piano, to feel what he felt, maybe even play a few chords. When he entered the room, the air was strangely cold despite the July heat. The piano stood there, shiny, massive, untouched. Jacob approached it with reverence, gently sitting down on the bench. He placed his fingers on the keys and played a soft tune, one of Elvis's lesser-known gospel songs. The moment the last note echoed into silence, the room changed. The lights flickered. A low hum began, deep and vibrating as though coming from beneath the house. Then Jacob heard it, the soft, deliberate press of piano keys behind him. He froze. He hadn't moved. Yet music filled the room again, now slower, sadder. He turned around, and his blood ran cold. A man was seated at the piano, his back turned, shoulders broad, hair dark and styled like it was frozen in time. He wore a gleaming white suit. And as he played, his foot tapped softly in time with the music. Jacob dared to whisper Elvis. The figure stopped. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it turned. The face was shadowed, unclear, but the smile, the infamous Elvis grin, was unmistakable. Except it wasn't warm. It was hollow, stretched unnaturally. And his eyes, they were empty. Dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. Elvis, or whatever remained of him, stood up and pointed to the bench Jacob had just vacated. Play, the figure said in a voice that sounded layered, like multiple echoes speaking at once. Shaking, Jacob sat down. He began to play again, this time Can't Help Falling in Love. The ghostly figure sat beside him, hands hovering over the keys, but never touching them. As the song reached its climax, Jacob felt something grip his wrists cold, heavy hands guiding his fingers faster, harder. He was no longer playing alone. Sweat poured from his face, and his heart pounded. Suddenly, the ghost leaned in and whispered, "They trapped me here," through the music. Jacob turned his head, but the spirit was gone. The keys beneath his fingers turned ice cold. The room plunged into darkness, and a blinding flash of blue light shot through the piano. Jacob was thrown backward into a display case, shattering glass and triggering alarms. Security rushed in, lights snapped on, and the piano stood empty. Silent. As if no one had touched it. Jacob was banned from Graceland after that, labeled a trespasser and dismissed as a publicity-seeking prankster. But what the media didn't report was the burn on his wrist, shaped like a music note that wouldn't fade for weeks. Or the voice he claimed still sang to him in his sleep, asking for help. Telling him it's not over. He later claimed in an interview that Elvis's soul had been tethered to the house, not because he loved it, but because something in that room, a song, an artifact, maybe even the piano, acted as a prison. And every time someone played his music in that space, it gave him just enough strength to reach out. Not to perform, but to beg. Jacob never played another Elvis song again. James Dean's death was fast, violent, and surrounded by an aura of doom that never quite faded from Hollywood history. The Porsche 550 Spider, he dubbed Little Bastard, gained instant infamy as more than just the vehicle he died in. It became a symbol of the eerie, the cursed, and the unfinished. Some say it wasn't just metal and bolts that perished that day on Route 466, but a restless soul trapped within it, screaming for closure. Decades later, when the car was finally rebuilt and displayed again, something long buried returned with it. Trevor Blake was a wealthy collector of rare Hollywood memorabilia. He wasn't superstitious, he was obsessed. His life's work had been restoring iconic pieces of history, Judy Garland's ruby slippers, Charlie Chaplin's cane, and now, the crown jewel, James Dean's Porsche. Most of the original parts had been scattered or destroyed, but Trevor had tracked them down over years. The steering wheel from a private collector in Germany. The engine from a scrapyard in California. The blood-stained seatbelt sold anonymously on the dark web. By the time he reassembled the car, it looked flawless, gleaming silver, low to the ground, with the words "Little Bastard" freshly painted on the rear in red. He stored it in a climate-controlled garage, intending to debut it at an exclusive Hollywood memorabilia event. But the very night the car was completed, the trouble began. Trevor had a dream, so vivid it felt more like a memory. In it, he was standing in the middle of the highway at dusk. The wind roared, and from the horizon, a silver blur approached fast. Behind the wheel was a young man, James Dean, his eyes wild, his mouth open in a scream that never produced sound. Just before the crash, Dean looked straight at him and mouthed, "You weren't supposed to bring it back." Trevor awoke in a cold sweat. The image burned into his mind. Brushing it off, he proceeded with the unveiling the next day. But the garage lights flickered constantly, and the security system glitched. The camera footage caught strange static around the Porsche's outline, and more than once, guests reported hearing someone whisper "Rebel" in the background. Then came the accidents. His assistant slipped and broke her arm while detailing the car's fender. A mechanic had his hand crushed while adjusting the engine, claiming the gearshift jerked forward on its own. Trevor's neighbor's dog barked at the garage for hours every night until it collapsed from exhaustion. Still, Trevor refused to believe anything supernatural was at play. Until the night the Porsche started itself. Trevor had gone to bed early but was awakened by the sound of the engine revving. He raced downstairs and found the garage filled with smoke. The car headlights were on. The engine roared louder than he thought possible from a vehicle parked in neutral. Worst of all, the driver's seat was occupied. James Dean. Pale, torn, bloody shirt, and glass in his hair. His hands gripped the wheel. He turned his head toward Trevor and said, "This was my death. Not yours." And then the car vanished, engine cut, smoke gone, lights out. All in a blink. Terrified, Trevor called a priest, then a paranormal investigator, then even a Hollywood historian. All of them said the same thing: some things should stay buried. The Porsche wasn't just a vehicle, it was a contract. Dean had poured so much of himself into that car, his final passion project, his rebellion, his identity, that when it crashed, a part of him fused with it. Every attempt to rebuild or restore it was seen as betrayal. Each bolt, each screw, reminders of a legacy interrupted. Dean didn't want resurrection. He wanted peace. On the final night, Trevor wheeled the car out onto the original crash site. She lived in a cramped studio apartment in North Hollywood and spent her days working part-time as a barista while building a reputation as a psychic medium through online readings. She wasn't your typical Hollywood hopeful chasing fame through film or music. Jessa chased the dead. Her TikTok clips and late-night live streams slowly attracted followers, many curious, others skeptical. She'd earned a modest name for herself among paranormal enthusiasts as the Hollywood medium who talks to the stars. What began as a gimmick quickly grew into something darker. Jess, armed with a vintage makeup mirror she bought from an estate auction rumored to have once belonged to the late actress, she went live on her stream. The candles flickered. The mirror fogged. Her viewers laughed it off, assuming smoke or effects. But Jessa saw something they didn't. Behind her, in the reflection, stood a blonde figure brushing her hair slowly, lips moving silently. After the stream, she couldn't sleep. Marilyn's voice haunted her dreams. "They won't let me rest." When she awoke, the mirror had cracked straight down the middle. Weeks later, Jessa attempted another connection, this time with Elvis Presley. She had acquired an old vinyl record from a collector, one of his rarest, said to have been played during his last night alive. She placed it on a dusty turntable and played it backward during the seance. The audio warped, and for a moment, it wasn't music. It was breathing. Then, a deep male voice echoed through her speakers. "You hear me now?" Jessa's followers multiplied overnight, drawn to her authenticity and the eeriness of her content. But behind the screen, her life was unraveling. Lights in her apartment flickered uncontrollably. Doors slammed without wind. And shadows, long, dragging, shapeless, crawled across her ceiling as she tried to sleep. Still, she pushed forward. One final connection, James Dean. She'd gotten her hands on a cracked steering wheel, rumored to be from the original wreckage of Dean's Porsche 550 Spider. She placed it on her table and went live with a bold claim. "Tonight, I connect with three souls: Marilyn, Elvis, and James Dean. The triangle of the forever young. The cursed. The forgotten." The moment the stream began, chaos erupted. Her candles exploded in a gust of wind that came from nowhere. Thousands of viewers watched as Jess's face distorted, her eyes rolling back, her mouth moving without sound. Jessa deleted all her accounts the next day, moved out of her apartment, and was never seen online again. Some claim she was silenced by Hollywood elites. Others say she went mad. But those who watched the live stream that night all agree on one thing. At the end of the video, just before the screen cut to black, three silhouettes appeared in the mirror behind her. One brushing her hair, one sitting at a piano, and one gripping a steering wheel. After the haunting incidents involving Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, and James Dean, one man became obsessed with the idea that their spirits weren't just randomly restless, but connected by something far more sinister. His name was Evan Shore, a former crime journalist turned paranormal investigator. He had been following Jessa Langford's rise and sudden disappearance, studying every live stream, decoding every symbol she unknowingly scribbled during her trances. One recurring detail stood out: a cemetery. Not one of the grand celebrity resting places like Forest Lawn or Westwood Village. No, this was a forgotten graveyard tucked behind the hills of Ojai, California. And strangest of all, he was on set uncredited as a second-unit director during one of James Dean's earliest commercials. These weren't coincidences. Blaine's life, these objects weren't simply haunted, they were cursed talismans, crafted to imprison. But the question remained, why? Why go through all this? In a final, chilling entry dated just days before his death, Victor wrote, "If they won't act in life, they will act in death. The world will watch forever." Evan made his way to the cemetery at dawn. With a crowbar and a small spade, he knelt at Victor Blaine's grave. The ground was soft, disturbed recently, as if something had moved beneath. With each scoop of earth, Evan felt the air around him grow heavier, colder. As he uncovered the rusted metal box beneath the tombstone, thunder rumbled overhead though the sky remained clear. Inside the box were three items: a lock of platinum blonde hair wrapped in silk, a broken piano key stained with fingerprints, and a mangled car emblem marked 550. Evan's breath caught in his throat. These weren't just symbolic trinkets. They were the original pieces, the true anchors of the curse. Victor hadn't just haunted them with objects. He'd buried the source, the heart of the binding, right here with him. But there was something else in the box too. A final film reel, unlabeled, sealed with wax. Evan rushed home and loaded the reel into a vintage projector. What he saw nearly made him drop the machine. It wasn't a film. It was surveillance, grainy black and white footage of Marilyn sitting in front of a mirror, then Elvis at a piano, and finally Dean in his Porsche. All from odd angles, like hidden cameras. As each scene played, their expressions grew fearful. Then a shadow entered the frame, each time the same shape, tall, thin, wearing a hat. Victor Blaine. He hadn't just trapped them. He had watched them suffer, recorded it, feeding off their agony like an audience demanding more. Evan now understood. The cemetery was not just a resting place. It was the stage. And the show wasn't over. That night, Evan returned to the cemetery with a match and gasoline. He burned the box. But just before the flames consumed the final piece, a voice whispered behind him, "You've stopped nothing. The curtain always rises again." Evan turned around, but the cemetery was empty. Or so it seemed. Victor Blaine's name had been almost completely erased from film history, a ghost in his own right. But his story, long buried beneath decades of glamorous Hollywood myths, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. What Evan Shore uncovered after the discovery at the cemetery wasn't just about a cursed grave or three restless celebrities. It was about a man who had turned rejection into obsession, and finally into revenge against the very industry that had discarded him. Victor was once a promising young filmmaker in the silent film era. Known for experimental, almost surreal scenes, he developed a reputation for being too artistic for the mainstream. Studios labeled him difficult, and producers found his visions confusing. He was never given the budgets he deserved. Despite working with rising stars like Monroe, Presley, and Dean before they became icons, his name never appeared in the credits. Projects were re-edit, res-hot, or shelved entirely, his fingerprints wiped clean. This erasure drove him into isolation. According to old newspaper clippings and a private memoir Evan managed to find through a Hollywood auction, Blaine spiraled into madness. The memoir was disturbing, written more like a script than a diary. It described an eternal film that could only be captured using real emotion, not acting, but genuine pain. He believed that the industry had created gods out of flawed humans, and he alone could expose their real faces. Not through stories, but through suffering. He referred to Marilyn, Elvis, and Dean not by name, but as the starlet, the king, and the rebel. He called them his caste. He wrote about the energy of performance, theorizing that it could live beyond death if bound to meaningful artifacts. Hollywood gave them roles, he scrawled in shaky handwriting, but I gave them purpose. His obsession intensified after a failed premiere of his only full-length film, which was booed off the screen. The studio shelved it permanently, and Blaine vanished from public view. But in secret, he pursued the occult, studying ancient Egyptian and Sumerian rites, particularly those tied to immortality and binding spirits. He allegedly conducted rituals using items from his former collaborators, Marilyn's hairbrush, Elvis's cigarette lighter, a spark plug from Dean's Porsche. He believed these objects held the emotional residue of their owners. But the binding required more than objects, it needed betrayal. Blaine orchestrated events to insert himself into the final moments of each star's legacy. Rumors suggest he was one of the last people to visit Marilyn shortly before her death, offering her a forgotten script. A studio guard swore Blaine was seen near Graceland the night Elvis died, though no proof ever surfaced. And bizarrely, a photograph exists of James Dean standing beside a tall, uncredited crew member during a car commercial shoot just weeks before his fatal crash. Blaine had manipulated the narrative from the shadows. He didn't want credit. He wanted control. He saw their fame as a prison and believed he could weaponize it. Evan also uncovered one final, chilling note in Blaine's private collection. It wasn't written by him, but by an assistant who fled mid-project. He talks to them at night. Says they answer. Says they cry. I've seen the mirror fog without steam. I've heard piano music with no one in the room. And I swear that car in the shed moves when he sleeps. What Blaine had done was more than a curse. It was a film, one still in progress. Each haunting was a scene. Each victim who encountered the ghosts became part of the audience. The more fear and belief people poured into the stories, the stronger Blaine's grip became. Even in death, he was directing. Evan began to suspect that Blaine's grave was more than a resting place. It was the projection room. His spirit didn't just bind the celebrities to objects, it manipulated them, used them like puppets, replaying their greatest fears for an audience of one, him. Worse, the more people watched, the more they shared the stories, the more powerful he became. Blaine's revenge wasn't personal. It was theatrical. And now, Evan feared, Blaine had found a new medium. Not celluloid. Not tape. The internet. Evan Shore had spent years writing about hauntings, debunking urban legends, and chasing cold cases of the supernatural. But this was different. He wasn't just researching ghosts anymore. He was living inside a story someone else had written. A director's final script that hadn't ended with Victor Blaine's death. If anything, that was only the intermission. After uncovering the truth behind Blaine's manipulation of Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, and James Dean, Evan knew what he had to do. The cursed objects, the mirror, the piano key, and the Porsche emblem had been recovered from Blaine's grave. But they weren't inert relics. They were vessels, and Blaine's spiritual prison was still very much active. The only way to end it was to break the connections, return the items to the exact locations tied to the souls they imprisoned. Each journey would be dangerous. Each object carried its own wrath. But if Blaine's ritual had rooted these spirits in trauma, perhaps healing could finally release them. Evan began with Marilyn Monroe's mirror. Wrapped in thick black cloth, it seemed to hum with a low vibration. He drove to the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, where Marilyn was buried. The skies were gray, and the air grew icy cold as he approached her crypt. As soon as he unwrapped the mirror and placed it on the marble floor, the reflective surface fogged instantly. And then Marilyn's image appeared, distant and flickering like an old film reel. She looked at Evan, not with fear or malice, but sadness. "He told me I'd never be forgotten," she whispered. "But this wasn't what I wanted." Evan held her gaze and said aloud, "You're free now." The mirror cracked down the middle and then shattered completely, its shards vanishing into mist. The weight in the air lifted. For the first time since he'd touched the mirror, Evan could breathe easily. Next came the piano key. Evan traced it to an old, long-abandoned Memphis blues club called the Velvet Tune, where Elvis was known to perform impromptu sets before his fame. Now rotting and covered in vines, the building stood like a mausoleum of music. Inside, the stage was still intact. The piano, though broken, still sat in the corner, silent and sad. As Evan placed the key back into its socket, the club seemed to come alive. Music swelled from nowhere, soft gospel notes, haunting and beautiful. A figure emerged on stage, Elvis, not in a jumpsuit, but in a plain shirt and slacks, young and human. He looked out across the empty room and spoke softly, "I just wanted to play." Then he faded, and the piano fell silent forever. Evan left the club as the sun broke through the clouds, warmth finally replacing the eerie chill. Lastly, the Porsche emblem. Returning it meant going to the exact stretch of road where James Dean had died, Route 466 near Chelan, California. The area was desolate, hot, and dry, but Evan felt the cold creeping in again as he approached the crash site. He placed the emblem on the ground, right where Dean's car had been torn apart. Tires screeched in the distance. Evan looked up to see a vision, repeat of the fatal moment. Dean's car speeding toward the curve, the impact, the sound of shattering metal. But this time, Dean emerged from the smoke, whole. He looked straight at Evan, lips unmoving but voice heard loud and clear in Evan's mind, "Thank you for ending the ride." The emblem melted into the dirt like candle wax under the sun. Each object was gone, each spirit released. Evan returned home, convinced the curse was broken. That Victor Blaine's final act had finally ended. But peace came at a price. That night, as Evan edited the footage of his journey for documentation, his screen went black. Then a line of text appeared, white, simple, centered. "The show must go on." The footage began to replay itself in reverse. His voice was distorted, the images glitching. And somewhere deep in the audio, he heard clapping. Applause. Blaine hadn't just created a curse. He had made something immortal. And Evan had just made it go viral. Evan Shore believed the nightmare was over. He had returned the cursed items to their rightful places, released the spirits of Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, and James Dean, and documented the entire process for the paranormal research community. He even uploaded a short, respectful documentary to a private server, a controlled space, viewed only by other researchers. It was meant as closure. Evidence. A warning. But Blaine had always been one step ahead. 3 nights after the upload, Evan received a strange call. No number. Just static at first. Then music. Soft and slow, the haunting melody of "Can't Help Falling in Love." The song warped as though being played from a worn-out record. Then came the whispers, "Don't forget me," in a voice that cracked like a broken radio. Finally, a sharp screeching of tires cut through the line. The call dropped. His phone turned itself off. He brushed it off as interference, perhaps a prank from someone who had seen his work. But when he went to check the video server, something was wrong. His documentary had been duplicated and re-uploaded dozens of times. Not just on his site, but somehow across the internet. TikTok clips, YouTube shorts, creepy Reddit threads. People had even started using AI to recreate the voices of the 3 stars, acting out fictional dialogues, thinking it was all part of an entertainment trend. But the comments under these videos were strange. Viewers reported vivid nightmares, hearing whispers in their homes after watching, even catching glimpses of reflections that didn't belong to them. One user wrote, "I saw a blonde woman in my bathroom mirror. She smiled at me and then disappeared." Another said, "I swear I heard a piano playing in my garage. I don't even own one." And then, something terrifying happened. Evan woke one morning to find a film reel on his doorstep. No return address. Just a note that read, "Director's cut, final scene." He took it inside and played it, against his better judgment. The film was grainy but unmistakable. It was footage of him, Evan, filming himself at each haunted site. But in every frame, there was something else in the background. A tall shadow, face obscured, hat tilted low. Blaine. Watching. Directing. Then came the final scene. It showed Evan asleep in his bed last night. He hadn't recorded anything. No cameras were running. But Blaine had filmed it. The screen faded to black, followed by the sound of applause, slow, mocking. And a voice, deep and smooth, "Thank you for playing your part." Terrified, Evan destroyed the reel and erased every trace of his documentary from the internet. Or at least he tried. Within hours, the videos were back, duplicated, mirrored, translated into other languages. It was spreading. Not just the story, but the energy. The curse. That's when Evan realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't about the three ghosts. It was never about Marilyn, Elvis, or Dean. It was about Blaine. He had used their fame, their pain as bait. But now the world was listening, watching, believing. And that's all he needed. Because belief is power. Blaine had found a new stage. Bigger than any old Hollywood lot. More permanent than a reel of celluloid. He now lived in the internet. In every video, every repost, every whispered retelling. Every time someone says, "Have you heard that ghost story about James Dean?" Blaine's reach grows. His influence deepens. He doesn't need a camera anymore. Blaine isn't finished. He's just found a bigger crowd. Then silence. To this day, Evan hasn't been seen. Some say he fled the country. Others say he disappeared into thin air. But late at night, if you listen closely while scrolling paranormal forums or watching TikTok ghost stories, you might hear it. A woman brushing her hair in the mirror. A piano playing by unseen hands. Tires screeching down a forgotten highway. And over it all, a man's voice whispering, 87.